Hi everyone, this is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. Welcome to our discussion on sex roles and reversals. We're going to be looking at some of the religious foundations for the sex roles and reversals. You might have noted that there is a social obsession with sex roles. We're going to be focusing on female sex roles specifically in this particular discussion. And what we're going to be looking at is what appears to be an obsession with female sex roles, and then also a manipulation of females that has grown out of this obsession. And by obsession, I mean fixation on female roles, people being sort of possessed with the whole idea of thinking about female roles, people being consumed with female sex roles, preoccupied with female sex roles. And you see this preoccupation that is related to Abrahamic faith manifestations. You see this obsession related to a collective known as the manosphere, or these social media influencers. And then you also see a response to this in some instances of females being very ingratiating in terms of trying to accommodate what they apparently see as a fragile male ego by capitulating to this obsession and manipulation. What we're going to do is we're going to quickly look at the biological differences between males and females. We've talked about this before, but we're just going to talk about it briefly so that we have a little bit of a backdrop here. Because it apparently is a very important topic for many people. But again, what is growing out of this is a pattern of manipulation, or attempts at manipulating those individuals who would be understood as female. And so what we're going to also look at are these religious foundations for what many people now see as sex role reversal. But when you look at earlier scripture writings, you see the role reversal that people think is a role reversal. You see that actually in early scripture, and many people don't talk about it. They gloss over it, or they give it a different interpretation. And so we're going to look at that so that you have a better idea of this sex role dynamic and sex role reversal actually in the Bible. You see it in the story of Adam and Eve. And if you are familiar with the narrative of Adam as an individual and Eve, you remember that in the narrative, Adam is initially presented as passive, dependent, a follower, and blaming. In other words, Adam is not taking any responsibility. And so that plays into that whole idea of being passive and dependent. And he's also pictured as an individual who is a follower. He's not a leader in the initial narrative, and he is, again, blaming, if you remember the narrative. On the flip side, you have Eve presented as very active, behaviorally active, cognitively active. You see her acting independently. You see her taking on a leadership role, but you also see her as being manipulated. And so you see her being manipulated, but also doing a little bit of blaming. But when you look at this presentation of Adam and Eve, you see what today would be considered these role reversals. And so typically you would expect, according to the standard gender narrative, and gender is distinct from sex, according to the gender narrative of what's masculine and what's feminine, Eve is operating initially as the masculine principle, so to speak. And you see Adam operating as the feminine principle. So he's operating passive and dependent, following, and Eve is operating active, independent, and leading. And just as a quick reminder, when we are talking about sex, we're talking about the biological classification of maleness or femaleness. And then when we're talking about gender, we're talking about the psychosocial understanding of oneself as masculine, feminine, androgynous. And so, as a quick reminder, in terms of classification, you have males having the X and the Y chromosome. You also have the females carrying two X chromosomes. So, with respect to the males, interestingly, they actually carry the sex chromosome makeup for both male and for female, whereas females only carry the sex chromosome makeup for females. So females only have X, whereas males have X and Y inside of them. Now, generally, individuals tend to focus on what is external, what is superficial to determine whether they perceive someone as male or female. But of course, there are things going on under the surface that serve to determine that classification. And so you have those chromosomes going on under the surface. You have the hormones going on under the surface. And sometimes what you see on the surface is inconsistent with what is going on internally, because you can have, even though you have the XY chromosome dynamic for males and the XX chromosome dynamic for females, you can have things going on with respect to those chromosomes that challenge the standard classification. And so you have individuals who may have more than two X chromosomes. You have individuals who may have some problems in terms of the XY chromosome pair. And so when that occurs, you have some other dynamics going on that are not the standard dynamics in terms of what's going on under the surface. And then, of course, you have individuals who may not have hormones under the surface that are consistent with what you would expect to see based upon the chromosome dynamics or the external manifestations. And this is so you can have a visual of what it looks like in terms of the male and the female chromosome makeup. And so you see on the right hand side the two X chromosomes for the female. And then you see on the left hand side the X chromosome for a male and the Y chromosome for a male. And what's noteworthy is that you see the X chromosome is full length, and so it's consistent with what you see on the right hand side with respect to the female having the two X chromosomes. But you see the Y chromosome is abbreviated. In other words, it's not full length. And so you have a heavier manifestation of this X in relation to this Y with males. But males are the ones who actually carry the genetic makeup for both male and female inside of the male. The female does not carry the genetic makeup for both male and female. Now we're going to shift gears and go back to the discussion about Adam and Eve in Scripture and how you have this apparent role reversal based upon current standards with Adam and Eve. And so again, you see Adam as he's being presented as passive and dependent. You see Eve being presented as active and independent. What's also noteworthy is how Eve is described in terms of her role when she is created according to the narrative. What was her purpose? According to this narrative, you have Adam who's dressing the garden. That's supposed to be his role. And she is presented as someone who's going to be his help meet. Now, that word meet is not necessarily the correct word that's in there that you see in terms of the translation. And so basically you just have help. But the understanding of the word help is what is interesting and what brings into question this role that's supposed to be played by Eve. It's not the standard, traditional, old fashioned role that people tend to present with respect to females. It's an extremely independent and extremely active leading type of role that is being presented in terms of who Eve is supposed to be representing with respect to Adam. It also perhaps gives some clarity to this idea of a man leaves his mother and father and cleaves to his wife. And so, again, you have this going from dependency to dependency with respect to Adam. You don't hear a narrative about Eve or a woman leaving her mother and father and cleaving to her husband. You also don't really see any information about the role, the sex role of Adam. What is his role in relation to who is defined as Eve? That's not clear. So all you have is this dynamic of Eve's role being clarified. And it's a very interesting role given all of these assertions and obsessions and manipulations around sex roles, particularly female sex roles. So, again, keep in mind that you don't have a lot of clarity about what Adam is supposed to be doing. What you have is a narrative about what Eve represents. And so, we love etymologies, but before we go into that, we're just going to look at how Eve is presented in terms of her role, in terms of her sex role. What is it that she is called to do? What is her purpose in relation to this entity known as Adam? And what you find when you do a close reading of the scripture is that she's presented as this help meet, in other words, a helper. But when you deconstruct what help means in this context, she is presented as one who is to minister to Adam. She is to protect Adam, and by protect, it's meant to guard Adam, to shelter Adam, to safeguard Adam, to watch over Adam, to shield Adam, and defend Adam. Now, of course, all of this is inconsistent with traditional theories or assumptions about female roles when you talk about female roles in current times. However, this is what is presented in terms of scripture when you're analyzing the scripture. And so she is a minister to Adam. She is supposed to protect Adam. She is presented as one who is providing assistance to Adam. In other words, that's that help. Her role is to comfort Adam. And then you have her providing this supportive role. So she's supposed to support Adam, aid Adam, provide for Adam, and rescue Adam. This is a very interesting dynamic because, again, this is not the general understanding of the female sex role, but this is the female sex role that is provided for Eve in this narrative. And perhaps in terms of a collective unconscious, this is what is being perceived in terms of the understanding of females when you talk about the manosphere or you talk about some of these influencers that see females as a sort of super powerful beyond any comprehension. And so perhaps, again, in some sort of collective unconscious way, there is a borrowing from this ancient narrative about Adam and Eve and the role of Eve, who is called by Adam in the narrative the mother of all living. And here you see that Eve is presented as this word azer, which means a help or a helper. And you see that azer means help, helper, helpers. And you see the manifestation of it multiple times in Scripture. And moving right along, you can see yet again that you have help and you have succor. You see even the concrete understanding of it is one who helps. And here again, you see this provision of aid or help. And when you go to the 5826 entry, you also see to help or succor. What's helpful here in terms of etymology is there's a breakdown, and it indicates that this is coming from a primitive root, and this primitive root meaning to surround, also to protect or to aid, to provide help. And so this goes along with that idea of Eve being presented as the protector, the aid, the defender, someone who is helping, someone who is providing assistance, someone who is ministering, that whole construct of succor, someone who is a help, someone who again is assisting. And so as we wrap this up, one of the things that you might note in all of these discussions about female sex roles, you see a focus on the female sex role, and you see, again, this is that eisegesis versus exegesis going on. You see individuals projecting onto Scripture whatever it is they believe in current times about female and male sex roles. And sometimes those projections are inconsistent with what the narrative actually happens to be. And so when you look at the actual narrative, you see that Eve is not presented as this passive dependent entity. She is presented as this very active entity. She's very behaviorally active. She's cognitively active. She's taking on a leadership role. Her leadership role is even unquestioned. You know, when she, in the narrative, she offers the fruit to Adam. He doesn't question it. He simply takes it. When confronted about all of this, he doesn't take responsibility for doing this. Instead, he blames his behavior on the female that was given to him. So the person who was presented as the minister for Adam, the protector of Adam, the person who's supposed to be safeguarding and defending and shielding Adam, Adam is basically saying the entity that was provided to do all of these things gave it to me. And so it was taken without question. And so you have a lot of individuals who have all sorts of narratives about female sex roles. These tend to come from individuals who are not identified as female, by the way. And so you have a lot of males acting as experts on the female sex role, on what it is that females should be doing and what females should not be doing, based upon their own current beliefs that might not be consistent with the narrative that they claim to be borrowing these narratives from. And so you have a number of issues that are going on here, because sometimes you have this narrative about the female sex role being used simply to manipulate, being used to gain some sort of foothold in order to have some cognitive control, some sort of behavioral control, some sort of spiritual control. And when individuals are doing this, you often also hear this sort of God complex thing going on. And so there is a focus on having this entity known as female being under submission. And so you can point to many instances in Scripture where this word, this construct came up with respect to males and females. But you have individuals in current times being fixated on this. And really, that fixation is probably not about the interpretation of Scripture. It appears to be really about simply a need, a personal need to dominate, a personal need to be revered, because you hear that in the dialogue. You hear this need to be put on a pedestal. You hear this need to be, again, worshipped, revered, obeyed. And so there is an obsession with this, and a disdain for any female who does not go along with this. And so it's an obsession when, quite frankly, that time, that focus could be used on self. And so instead of trying to figure out the sex roles of other people, that same time and energy could be better used trying to figure out what's really going on with the individual. What is it that is important to that individual for self? What does self need in order to grow and to flourish? But sometimes when people are not focused on self and figuring out how to make self grow and flourish, individuals become over invested in making other people be something, a focus on other people. In this instance, you're talking about, the sexes. And so when that focus is extreme, that fixation, that obsession, it takes away from the individual becoming the best that they can be. And so when you hear individuals who identify as male serving as these influencers, focusing inordinately, this inordinate focus on female sex roles, there's usually a situation where the time needed to focus on self is not there, because they are so focused on what's outside of self that they don't have time to focus on, for instance, their actual male role, if that's what they want to focus on. And so some of that energy and that attention should probably be turned inward versus externally. And so these are some things to think about when you hear all of these conversations, because it really makes no sense for, in a patriarchal world, in a patriarchal society, for those who are of the patriarchy, those who are males, it doesn't really make sense for them to be focusing that much on females. And so that which is considered the superior entity, for them to be focusing on what has been constructed as the inferior entity, speaks more about the individual than it does about the object, if you will, of obsession. And so this is food for thought for those of you who are doing this, and food for thought for those of you who are taking in these narratives and participating in these obsessions. The time, and this isn't just for males, it's not just for females, it's just the time that people spend focusing on others and what others are doing or not doing in terms of individual behavior in these gender roles or these sex roles. That really is, again, time that individuals could be using to focus on self. And so the question is, what would you be doing, or what would the person be doing if they were not focusing on these females, not obsessed with females, not fixated on females? That's not to say that individuals should not be considering females. It's just to say that too much of anything can be a bad thing. And in this instance, that is what we are seeing. Another thing to consider is that it has been noted that a number of individuals who are identified as influencers in various ways, those individuals tend to be having a target audience of younger females. And so in some instances, you have males who are old enough to be the fathers of the females that they are ministering to, or who they are coaching or who they are attempting to influence. And so a question to consider is whether that is an appropriate role for an individual who is old enough to be someone's father. Perhaps some of the advice giving, some of the scripture interpretation, some of the extrapolation from the interpretation would come better from the young female's father or the young female's mother, but perhaps not best coming from individuals who are old enough to be fathers who may not have the best of intentions at all times with respect to these females on social media who are being influenced. And of course, other individuals might have some reflections or wisdom that they would like to share with respect to this topic. And so as you consider the implications for all of this, I want to also give you something else to consider. In terms of these influencers, you only tend to see this dynamic, this fixation on sex roles, fixation on females, coming from males who are identified as American males. And in some instances, you have certain ethnicities that are highly focused. And so I want to encourage you to think about some of the other things that you could be focusing on versus focusing on female sex roles. It's unclear why this fixation is so heavy in America, but it is there. It's unclear why it's so heavy in a particular ethnic group, but it is there. But what I want you to do is to think about not only the implications for all of this, but what you could be doing otherwise with that time. And if you are coming from a religious perspective, instead of focusing on how you can get all of these different females to submit, a better use of time might perhaps be, especially since we're talking about a spiritual foundation for all of this, is focusing on how you can instead have a better relationship in terms of your spirituality with that you consider to be your creator. And so if there's a focus on submission, perhaps the focus should be on how you can better submit yourself with respect to your own relationship between what yourself and what you understand as your creator. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.